Podemos começar? Tá bom, então. Bom dia, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Alpaslan Özerdem from George Mason University. Professor, for a long time, we have the Center of International Studies, Negotiation Studies at the Department of Political Science, and we have been investing in the studies of international negotiations and conflict resolution. And your books have been a mandatory reading reference for our students. No. I'm very grateful for your willingness to come and speak here at the University of São Paulo. I would like to thank for Professor Rogério Arantes, coordinator of the Postgraduate Seminars Program, and Professor Rafael Villa, Dean of the Department of Political Science, who is attending the ERABED meeting today. Therefore, I would like to extend my gratitude to Áureo Toledo, Associate Professor at the Federal University of Uberlândia, who will introduce Professor Özerdem and coordinate this session. Áureo completed his master's and doctoral degrees here at the department, and he has been my student since his undergraduate studies in international relations a long time ago. So it's also a great pleasure to welcome you here, Áureo. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janina. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Department of Political Science. I would like to express all my gratitude to the faculty, but mostly to Professor Janina Nook. I was telling Alp that Janina is a sort of a guardian angel in my career. But thank you very much, Janina. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Rogério Arantes and Professor Rafael Villa, who are not here today, but they are really helpful to organize this seminar. I would like to introduce now our guest speaker today. Professor Alpaslan Özerdem is Dean of the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Professor Özerdem holds a PhD on post-war recovery studies from the University of York, and it's one of the main references in peace studies in the world today. His books and article influence the field a lot. So it's a pleasure, Alp, to have you here at the University of São Paulo, to have you this whole week with us. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, everyone. And it's really a great pleasure for me to be here. As Ira told us, it's been kind of like a tour of Brazil or the different universities. So, yesterday and day before, I was at the Federal University of Sao Paulo, and that was Association of Defense and Security Studies event. I spoke there first day, and yesterday I met with the IR students there, had another talk, and I was truly impressed with the students. I mean, they were brilliant. And that's my third stop here and a different university. And next time, if I prepare a program with you, I'm going to make sure that it's going to be slightly lighter program. So, because today I'm going to Rio, and tomorrow night I have another talk there. And I was determined that I would give a different talk at each place, so not repeat myself. And so when we're talking about what we can do here today. The idea was that because it's an intimate kind of like a small group of people, and a kind of a research seminar, and so I came up with several ideas, like what would be the focus of our discussions, and I really want to have a discussion, not just me presenting, and I hope that you'll be able to join me in this. And we decided that we could focus on the kind of the global governance of aid, humanitarian and development aid, in the context of Somalia, And I want to look at the role of Turkey within that as a rising power. So I thought that might be quite interesting in relation to Brazil, and Brazil as a rising power, member of BRICS, and so it's kind of like the what does that mean really to sort of global order, and whether or not those countries have anything to say about the way the humanitarian and development aid is delivered in war-affected countries. And I think that's kind of really the genesis of this article that we publish in Third World Quarterly. I don't know whether you had the chance to look at it. It's the Turkey and Somalia challenging Northwestern interventionism, question mark. And the reason I think my colleague Chuck Thiessen and I decided to focus on this is that there are really interesting questions around rising powers, right? On the one hand, they are seen as really kind of a critical alternative to the Western global order, and they are posing difficult questions and creating alternatives. Like in the context of Africa, 20, 30 years ago, the entire aid governance was dominated by the Western countries. But now there are other countries like China, India, Turkey, and they are also competing with this country. So the question there is that what that means for that aid governance. And in this article we name them as emerging and conventional interveners. Old and new didn't work for us, didn't really represent what we want to say. And the emerging is that those actors are in the scene, but they are not really fully accepted by that global governance, right? I mean, that's the really interesting part of it. And the reason we looked at this in the context of Somalia is because there is an example with Turkey as a rising power engaging in the delivery of aid and peace-building programs, and really it seemed that before we started this research as a kind of critical alternative to those Western powers. So we thought, well, rather than just sort of doing the same thing like academics do, kind of giving a critique of things, let's look at something that seems to be successful. And let's learn from that, right? And how that's kind of changing the relationship between the emerging and conventional interveners. We use the analytical framework of trustworthiness, right? So two actors, in this case, the emerging and conventional interveners. And in that analytical framework, we were looking at the ability and integrity as part of that trustworthiness. And we thought that's really allowed us to look at this from a case study-based qualitative work. We undertook 21 interviews with different stakeholders from that aid world, both from Turkish side and the conventional international aid actors. And we tested this unique context, Turkey in Somalia and what that means. And I think in terms of our conclusions, which I will come to later on, I think the status quo hierarchy of global governance and its promotion of liberal intervention norms were really kind of tested because of this relationship. So that's what I'm going to do. And I want to just talk about this. And I'm going to raise questions for you, and perhaps we can have the discussion. So let me start with the kind of like the first part. And that's the liberal intervention norms within the liberal peace ideology since the end of the Cold War. So, I mean, almost like, but now 30, 40 years. We've been operating through this liberal peace agenda, and as the international community going to those different places, whether they are Afghanistan, or Libya, or Syria, or Colombia, or countries affected by war, if there is a third-party intervention, whether this is through diplomatic means or military, at the end, the way that the international community structures and delivers is peace building really comes from that liberal peace ideology, right? And there are those two main components with that. Is the kind of like the democratization of that society, and probably it's the most undemocratic way of thinking about democracy, because there's a kind of particular power relationship, external actors going and doing the democratization, and also kind of like the delivery of the market economy systems. And so, it's almost like, no matter what your illness is, whether you have a headache or, cancer or, just something, a flu, the international community prescribes the same medicine to all these countries, and that's kind of presented as the way forward, to emerge from the war. And then I think within that ideology, there are many assumptions made about local populations and their inability of being part of the reconstruction process. It's very much kind of top-down, externally driven relationship. It's very much donor-driven agenda, and within that, the interventionism, in which in this article we use it in the most general sense. This will be a military intervention for security reasons, but also kind of like any programs that we undertake in such areas. In that kind of interventionism, there are a few characteristics that I want to just share with you, because really they are important for us to understand why that kind of global aid governance needs to be challenged, right? To start with, I mean, we are talking about certain types of actors and their self-interested agendas. So whether these are donor communities or the multilateral agencies, bilateral agencies, international NGOs, national NGOs, local NGOs, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, you have so many different actors, but you have a hierarchy amongst all these different actors, and it's very much based on the kind of starting point of funding and how it is distributed. It's very much like a pyramid, and the top, you have the top Western countries with their funding, and at the bottom you have the kind of community-based organizations. And by the time $100 starts from the top, it probably comes to like around $10 to be distributed to war-affected people, because there are all these different levels of cuts that each organization, each level, need to operate. So it's quite inefficient way of delivery of assistance. They claim that they have the universality of 8 principles. And over the last 30, 40 years, they built certain standards, like the severe humanitarian standards, which establishes like how much water you need to distribute or what tents that you need to do, that kind of standards. But also lots of kind of like the systemic standards, like coordination, cooperation structures, who lets and what kind of organization. So they call that professionalism. So the aid sector has a very sort of strong agenda of professionalism, and so that there is a protectionism, whether you are in it or out of that, framework is really important. And those critical actors from the Western countries, especially donors, control and monitor that system. So we are not just talking about a system that the altruistic reasons of helping war-affected people is the priority. It's very much like the self-interested geopolitical kind of concerns of donors and the way they devise the whole process. They tend to create dependency culture, because often those issues are addressed at quite a superficial level, And largely because there's a high level of securitization of aid. So we really look at the aid as a kind of a tool of security interest of the donor countries. There's the bunkerization of aid, so those who deliver aid tend to keep themselves away from war-affected communities. So the green zone in Baghdad, for example, kind of is surrounded by a wall and security, and so in order to reach to those people who came to your country to help you, you got to go through all sorts of security. And it's a very interesting dynamic. It's very actually disturbing kind of reality. It's almost like a sci-fi movie, right? You know, like the end of the world, and there's something happening, and there are aliens, and they are sort of governing the world. It's that kind of the world, because those people coming from outside, they often don't speak the local languages, they don't understand the local culture, they have their own values, and there's all that sort of imperial imposition, you know, of certain values and principles. And this is why that this kind of global aid governance is also considered as neocolonialism, especially in those countries emerged from colonialism, because you are establishing kind of new systems and new ways of controlling those populations, right? So these are really kind of like some of the characteristics that, for me, what global aid governance looks like, right? So with that kind of reality, let's look at Somalia and Turkey in Somalia, then I will come to the analysis. It was August 2011. Turkish Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, went to Somalia with a big entourage. He took his family, he took pop stars, he took business people. I think there were like around 400 people. You know, like 4 or 5 planes of people went to Mogadishu, the capital. Because at the time, Somalia was facing famine, there was a humanitarian crisis, but at the same time, Somalia was pretty much a forgotten, war-affected country. So, you know, it's one of these frozen humanitarian crises that, you know, sits there, but the international community doesn't pay that much attention. And there are so many of them, right? Because the international community is very selective to decide what is humanitarian crisis and what is not. Like at the moment, we are all interested in the war in Ukraine, but then we don't really talk about what happens in Yemen, where 3 million people were killed. We don't really pay much attention to the DRC, where the war has been over 5 decades and like over 5 million were killed. Like, you know, we are selective, and there are kind of, it's all to do with the, I think, racism to some extent, and the kind of cultural affinity, you know, all that sort of, you know, frame. So I think the reason President Erdogan and this big entourage went is just really kind of raise the profile of Somalia, but also I think it was very political. You know, if you do something international, you know, that means kind of like you increase your popularity domestically, right? I mean, you know, so it wasn't all, you know, for charitable reasons, but anyway, he did that. But one of the things that he did, he didn't use AMISOM. AMISOM is the regional peacekeeping forces in Mogadishu. And normally, a president or prime minister coming, you know, it would be the normal protocol, right? They would provide the security and everything. From the right at the beginning, he said, no, we don't want that. We are here in a friendly country. We are perfectly okay with our security. We don't need you. So the first message was immediately like, you know, this, you know, sort of conventional actors being pushed aside, right? Moment that their planes landed, the message was clear. You know, we arrive here and we are going to do something different, okay? And also, one of the things that, I mean, this, you know, visit created a big flow of Turkish aid to Somalia, particularly in Mogadishu, both state and private aid. I think in totality it was like around $350 million, right? And it was a direct engagement with state actors. So normally, in global aid governance, you work with civil society organizations and you avoid the state. It's all about the power relations, and state is considered as corrupt. Civil society is a better partner, right? The Turkish aid said, well, no, we're going to work with the state. That's our main partner here. And they coupled their aid with trade links, with diplomacy. They opened their embassy there. All sorts of education opportunities, like thousands of students from Somalia were given scholarships in Turkey. And Turkish Airlines provided the connection, the first international connection that outside Africa. So that was just like a big thing for Somalis, because for them to go to anywhere in Europe, in US, etc., they always had to fly to Nairobi or somewhere and then fly. And now with Turkish Airlines, they could fly directly from Mogadishu to Istanbul and then fly, right? So it was all about, like, not I'm here to provide you aid, but I'm here to trade with you and to work with your education institutions, etc. Different message, right? And this was so powerful because at the same time, the international community was delivering its assistance from Nairobi through remote management. So all aid agencies, United Nations and others, they had their bases in this peace camp at the airport in Mogadishu. So typically, a program manager based in Nairobi would fly to Mogadishu, to this camp, and with the local organizations, they meet there, and then she flies back home to Nairobi. And the kind of connection between the aid delivery and the people were just so isolated, right? And so that was a really bad reputation of the international community for inefficiency, for corruption, and they were kind of people, when we went there, one of the things that they kept telling us that, look, all these UN people and others, they are here to, make themselves richer. They live in a really nice life at this peace camp at the airport, and look at our lives, right? So in contrast to that, all Turkish aid workers, most of them brought their families. They were living in Mogadishu. They were working directly with these people. So you see the contrast here. On the one hand, the international community with the sort of like isolationism and the securitization and the protectionism, and on the other hand, Turkish aid, is like very much in Mogadishu and with war-affected people. So this is why it's a very unique case to test the way the global aid governance has been resisted and tested and what they meant. So with that, we undertook this study, and it was a 2 visits to Somalia and Nairobi in order to undertake our interviews. And my time in Mogadishu was probably one of the most exciting and interesting field research times I have ever had. I'm not a insecurity junkie. I mean, I pretty much take all the security measures, when I go to these countries. And all my, career, I work in, I think, over 15 different war-affected countries. But Somalia was quite exceptional, largely because everybody told me that it was unsafe. Everybody told me that I had to take, some sort of security, private security company support. And so that means like a vehicle with 4 men with arms and weapons following me wherever I go. And I was kind of thinking, oh my God, that's the, like the least favorable way of undertaking, academic research, right? You could imagine all sorts of implications about power relations and the way you sort of like, present yourself, etc. So that was like what I was told. But once I was there, because I'm originally from Turkey, I was at the time in the UK, but because I was originally from Turkey, I was able to contact the Turkish agencies. And they said, no, don't worry. we'll be just fine. So once I was in Mogadishu, from the airport to my hotel and the entire time, I didn't use any security at all. I mean, we would be stopped at the checkpoints, and I would only say that I'm Turkish. They would say, oh, pass, no problem, welcome, you know. So the contrast couldn't have been any greater than what I was told, right? So this is why I think it was really interesting, time as field research, like, how it was kind of portrayed to me and what I experienced. And that was because what happened 2011 onwards. I was there like almost 7 years later, right? And during that time, there were so many Turkish actors, aid agencies working there, right? So, and my colleague went to more comfortable Nairobi, and he was talking to international actors there. And but I must say, I think I got the better deal, by focusing on Somalia. So I think this whole analytical framework within the trustworthiness, ability and integrity was about the truster and trustee, and the way they perceived each other's ability in undertaking, humanitarian aid delivery, and how they do it in terms of integrity, right? So there's quite a big literature on trust, and especially organizational trust, and we adopted that to our purposes, like, what that kind of framework would mean in the aid world between two actors, two organizations, and how they perceive each other's ability and integrity. So we provided a matrix. So you have the two actors and ability and the integrity. So one quadrant is about Turkish perception of Northwestern ability or inability, and another one, Northwestern perceptions of Turkish ability, inability. The third one is about integrity for each other, right? 4 sectors, 4 quadrants. Now, let me just share some of my observations and findings for each aspect. And I think this is really interesting. So let's start with the Turkish perceptions of Northwestern ability. So typically, when we talk to those Turkish aid actors, they were criticized, the international community, for their remoteness, not having enough local credibility, or the credibility in the eyes of local people. And I triangulate that, with the local actors. They were right. The international community really didn't have much credibility in the eyes of local people. And then also, I think the inability of the Northwestern actors around effectiveness and efficiency problems. I mean, like, honestly, how could you run aid programs remotely from Nairobi? I mean, it's not even logical, let alone, possible, right? But their excuse that, well, the security conditions are such that in Somalia, and with our principles of professionalism and all the kind of security measures that we need to undertake, it's simply not possible to deploy our staff in Somalia, right? So I think that creates a huge level of effectiveness and efficiency problems, and also acceptance by local people. I mean, I talk to people, all walks of life, from the Somali, people in the government or in civil society, or shop owners or taxis, etc. The narrative they shared with me really was very much quite same about the international community and the way they perceived. And let's just bear in mind that the international community's presence in Somalia has been for 20, 30 years. Obviously, they had the disadvantage of a long history and big baggage, right? So many wars happen and the interventions, right? So Turkish intervention started in 2011. It was only 7 years. So, I bear that in mind. So the longer time frame is that, the chances of, things going wrong is higher. But nevertheless, I think Turkish actors had very negative perception of Northwestern ability. Now, when we look at the same ability question, but from the Northwestern perceptions of Turkish aid, to start with, I think it was quite positive. You know, they really sort of point out certain aspects of ability in terms of robustness, in terms of timeliness, in terms of presence. You know, I mean, they gave the Turkish president that credit. However, the conversation starts to become really interesting when they start to talk about the so-called good donorship ideals. So apparently there are some good donorship ideals, and in a way, what we were told is that, whether or not whether you apply Western-oriented donor ideals, whether or not you accept kind of this overall liberal peace goals, whether or not you believe that democratization is the only way of governance, whether or not you believe in market economy. I think that's what they were referring to, indirectly, this good donorship ideals. They said, okay, the Turks, they don't use local actors either. So, for example, for jobs, the projects on the ground, they bring their own NGOs to implement them. Because in the governance, this global governance of aid, in that hierarchy, so you create your intermediaries. And as an international NGO, perhaps they give you the impression that international NGOs like Save the Children or Oxfam, etc., they go to these countries and they implement projects. Often, they don't. They just commission the project to a local NGO, right? It is really the national NGO, local NGO does the job. And their managers just monitor, and evaluate. So, it was a surprise that actually NGOs from Turkey were implementing like the construction of hospitals and infrastructure, collection of rubbish. I mean, that was also a really interesting aspect of Turkish aid. They were very much involving in, sort of things that matter to people, right? Because in 2011, when Turkish presence arrived, the streets of Mogadishu was full of rubbish because nobody collected them for years and decades. So they brought a really heavy equipment from Turkey, collected them, cleared the roads, rehabilitated the roads. There were many hospitals. They built hospitals. So human security aspects, right? So the global aid governance was all about securitization, but also some of this, like what Turkish perception kind of considered soft measures, like the issues like human rights. That I'm just repeating what they said, or the gender mainstreaming, right? So they were saying that, well, they want to do things here, but they are not tangible. But look at what we've done. We really made Mogadishu livable for people, right? A big contrast. And so that was kind of like, a particular perception. And I think the international community was right with their inability of Turkish aid. It was Mogadishu-centric. So you could find, for example, international aid throughout Somalia, but Turks only focus in Mogadishu. So they were saying that, look, this is something that we need to consider. And they were saying, whether or not Turkey would have any leverage on the regional countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, which provided the largest part of the AMISOM, the regional peacekeeping forces, and they were making lots of kind of arguments around, well, this all depends on the political stability in Turkey. If the government changes, if Erdogan goes, well, the man never goes anywhere. So, but if Erdogan goes, the whole interest in Somalia will disappear. So these were kind of like their critique of the Turkish presence and so their perception. So these are kind of ability questions. Around integrity, let me start with the Turkish perceptions. So they thought that the Western aid was based on wrong motivations. The kind of accusations that, oh, this is all about geopolitics for them, they are self-interested. The international community, really, they just want to have that sort of historical colonial interference. EU just wants to have that presence because Italy's colonial past here in Somalia. This kind of integrity questions, right? And the whole kind of Western conceptions of state building and democratization, fixation of soft issues, etc. So, as far as the Turkish perception is concerned, the Western aid didn't have that integrity, and it was so visible why it didn't have integrity, simply because they were doing this remotely. How would you have integrity and real interest, and then try to deliver millions of dollars aid remotely? That was their main argument. On the other hand, Northwestern perceptions of Turkish integrity was around similar points, interestingly. They were accusing Turks also, like, being self-interested. And they were saying that, oh, look, they are just using aid as an entry point. But all they are interested in trade, their political influence in Africa, and all sorts of other things. And, I think some of these questions they were raising is justified. And one point that they were making is that all about Turkish aid, because they work with the government, they are ambivalent to the government corruption. They are turning a blind eye to this in order to work with the government. I mean, having listened all that, all these perceptions, the question that I was about, I want to ask is that, look, I've experienced international aid in all sorts of different countries, and all the issues you are raising about Turkish aid and its integrity were the question marks I had about international aid in other countries. So this is almost kind of self-righteousness, right? Here we are international actors, we set the agenda, we decide who is in, who is out. It's almost like the process of the othering, right? So if we don't co-opt into our framework, then you are the other. And in order to do that, you need to have the same values and principles. You need to believe in liberal peace agenda. So I think there were really two arenas of contestation in Somalia around protecting the hierarchy of global governance. The conventional actors were very critical about the Turkish presence because I think they saw Turkish presence as a threat, as a risk, as a kind of like a place where their governance structure was questioned, put in the test. There were many places until then, because pretty much in all other places, the international global governance dictates the whole agenda. Very first time, there was a rising power, emerging actor, kind of doing something different. And it was almost like the juxtaposition of what they do. Instead of remote management, they were living with people. And you cannot really change that kind of reality, no matter how much money you spend for marketing and visibility of your programs. Sometimes black is black, white is white. And that's what's kind of seen by local people. And then I think that kind of like the reality of questioning made those international actors really uncomfortable, because in the sense that, well, actually, their liberal intervention norms around democratization and human rights can be questioned by those actors. What they provide as alternative in terms of working on tangible issues, infrastructure, services, etc., and also treating those war affected countries not only recipient of aid, but also partner. The message with Turkish aid has always been like, we are here to trade with you. We are here not as a colonial power like you have in this country, but we are here to treat you like an equal. That sends quite a different message, because I'm afraid in such environments we have a very unhealthy power relationship for the reasons that I explained earlier. And I think this kind of whole protection of the international aid governance, few things I want to share and conclude there, and then we can start to talk about, and have a conversation. So, cooperation and coordination, they are considered as the main vehicles of international aid governance. And until this example, to be honest, I'll be very honest with you, I was so pro cooperation and coordination. I thought that increases efficiency and effectiveness. Clearly, that's good for war-affected people. But cooperation and coordination can be tools of control. And I think that's what happens with the global aid governance. They use those structures so that they don't really want to give voice and ability and agency to rising powers to be part of this. So, because in order to be part of this coordination structures, they are often quite complex. They are led by UN agencies, and there's a regular reporting, etc., right? That really, I think, is the Somalia shows that cooperation and coordination has a darker side. We really need to think about that. And then I think ideological protection of approved interventions was so kind of like on the surface here. And I would consider this as the boundaries of the conventional intervention versus Turkish transgression. And Turkish transgression in this area, I don't want to say that it kind of shamed the international aid governance, but it exposed them, right? And really provided the kind of like the tangible alternatives. And I think the resistance agency of the challenger is really important. So, in this whole debate around BRICS countries, what they are able to do in geopolitics and in certain sectors like peace and conflict and everything, I think it's a question that we really need to explore further, that resistance agency. So, Brazil, for example, had an extensive role in Haiti. There were successes and failures, etc. I mean, I think it would be really interesting to look at the role of Brazil in its region and also globally. What kind of resistance value Brazil could bring to this debate, right? What Brazil could do differently so that the international aid governance would be exposed further? Because they need to be, for the reasons I shared at the beginning. The governance structure they have is hierarchical, is ineffective, it's not helping to war-affected people. It's self-interested agenda. So, right, I think there's a responsibility of, coming up with alternatives. So it also kind of showed that global governance of conflict zone intervention is not impenetrable to challenges from emerging conflicts. Sometimes all you need to do to open the floodgates, then the water flows. Right? I think Somalia was a really kind of interesting milestone. It was tested. It showed that it can be penetrable and alternatives can actually live. And finally, what I want to say is that I now want to read this because it's in a paper and I like the whole sentence, and I want to conclude with that. So the resulting friction between Turkish contestation and conventional defensiveness reveals the potential of and limits to revising the status quo hierarchy of global governance and promoting less securitized and more proximate intervention methodologies. I mean, I think, Somalia case and Turkey in Somalia as a case study, for me, the question mark was challenging Northwestern interventionism. The answer is yes. It has a challenge. But the problem here is that how would you be able to take that and implement in other places? Is Somalia was just so unique that this cannot be, it cannot be repeated in other places? And would Turkish engagement, for example, in other places have similar political support, because it was a political project for Erdogan, right? That's also really important. So these are certain weaknesses with this. But abstraction of this whole idea of resisting the global aid governance, I think it's an important one. And Somalia showed that it's possible and we can do this. So the question is that for rising powers like Brazil, what could be the potential to do this? I think the cooperation, South-to-South cooperation, is really important. For example, aid actors in Brazil and Turkey, right? Do they talk to each other? Can they actually unify, some policies and ways of doing things, right? So it could be even stronger alternative to global aid governance, right? So to change that, hierarchy. So that's why I want to stop. And if you haven't read the paper yet, do. I think it's interesting. But let's have a chat. And I really want to kind of hear your views and perceptions of the global aid governance, the wider liberal peace agenda, and particularly I want to learn from you, right, in terms of your views of the role of Brazil as an emerging, rising power, right, and what Brazil can do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alp. It was a great presentation. Again, the third one here in Brazil. A gente tem um tempinho para perguntas, inclusive se eventualmente vier do YouTube, né? Quem tiver perguntas pode fazer.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the conference and for amazing thoughts about the global aid hierarchy of governance. But what I was thinking about is, you mentioned liberal peace as a framework for this global aid governance, and this implies a number of factors and relations of power that I'm not familiar with the Somalia case, so I'm going to talk a bit of what I have seen in Latin America and the levels of power at play when we talk about global aid governance, because I will start with the local. When you talk about, when you move from aid to development and development-based interventions, as you mentioned, Turkey's case, I remember the very local examples I have of cash-based interventions in some cities of El Salvador, for example. And what I heard from people working with aid at the moment was that they did not account for the power relations at the local level. For you give aid to some groups, some organizations, and they, it becomes a political issue. It's always political, but it becomes a way of straining some actors. And there is winners and losers here. And when you talk about Turkish, and you mentioned that your Turkish received the same criticisms as you did to the global aid at the higher level, I'm thinking that maybe the same interventions as they were conducted in Somalia and as they were conducted in El Salvador, they did not account for the power level relations that were happening at the time, because it was Mogadishu-centric. They focused on the city, but at the regional level, they had AMISOM. They had the global aid hierarchy already operating in other spaces. So could they conduct their operations without this higher level global aid and AMISOM doing the security in other levels, in other parts of the country? Could they operate without this? And are they operating, or they presenting alternatives really? Or are they just, operating within the same frame but doing their own thing, and they're just another actor doing their own thing within the liberal framework? This is just what I was thinking here in your case. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that question opens up really different and interesting types of relations. So in the case of Turkish presence in Mogadishu, so it wasn't in Somalia, so that was one of the constraints. They didn't want AMISOM, full stop. And in fact, they thought that the presence of AMISOM created more insecurity, because AMISOM had its own enemies. And I would be pretty confident that, obviously, indirectly, they provide certain level of security and everything, and it's benefited. But, it was a deliberate attempt of not to be seen with any of these international actors, whether security or UN or aid agencies, because Turkish actors thought that by being seen together, their neutrality, their unique kind of position would be damaged. And the expression they use, we don't want to get dirty. So because that's what the locals kind of refer to the international community. They do dirty business, right? So that was like that's I think is quite interesting in terms of power relations. But in the context of El Salvador, when I went there, like 15 years after the peace agreement, my question was like, what happens to former combatants after 15 years? So FMLN, like their reintegration. And El Salvador is always considered as a success story in the field of DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, because that, the whole ex-combatant needs kind of were incorporated in the peace agreement. Partly because that was a large land reform, right? So whenever you read the literature, land reform as part of peace agreement was considered as a success, because the war was very much around the, the access to land and production, because 85% of land in the country was controlled by 13 families. So this peace agreement was addressing the root causes of the war, blah, 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 right? So that's kind of the story. So I want to kind of see, well, what happens so many years after with the former combatants? So immediately after the signing of peace agreement, you have one, the reality, but then times kind of like create different realities. So my took of the DDR process in El Salvador was quite different. It was quite negative, to be honest. And the land reform they undertook wasn't that successful at all. To start with, the plot of land was given to ex-combatants, were probably the worst land available. So, it was all lip service. So yes, they were given land, but they couldn't really cultivate it. Number two, most of FMLN combatants, they didn't want to be a farmer, even if they came from village, because during the fighting they spent so much time in urban areas, etc. They see their life in a city, not in a village, but they were enforced to do that, to take this, because ideologically, especially for FMLN side, land is important as it's ideologically, this is what the war was about. You are going to take this land, right? It's not only the government, but also the armed group really dictated, kind of file rank combatants. Interesting power relationship, because we tend to think about the power relationship between the state actors and others, but within the armed groups, there are really interesting power relations. And FMLN had like 17 different armed groups, and their agreement was quite critical to the peace agreement and all that. And more importantly, for ex-combatants to become farmers, they need support with microcredit, with fertilization, this and that. So you don't just because you have a land, you suddenly become this wonderful farmer. And they did kind of romanticization of this post-conflict, right? So to a poor war-affected man given a plot of land, and next year it will be plenty of food, he will be able to look after his family. That's only imagination. Most of these file and rank combatants of FMLN were living in poverty. 10 years, 15 years after that. Most of them sold the land, whatever price that they could get. They didn't have a job, they didn't get support. You know what really affected your trajectories of better life as a former combatant in El Salvador? It was who you were before the war. Whether or not you had education, whether or not you had some sort of job, whether or not you had a network, whether or not you were coming in a particular class, right? They were more informing to your chances of post-conflict than what the DDR program provided to you, right? So this is why I always say that when it comes to power relations and DDR and peace building, it really starts and ends with people and who they are, right? You got to focus on them. So when you just look at them as a homogeneous population, it's the FMLN combatants. Let's give them just one thing and they'll be just happy. You are not addressing the problem there at all. So thanks very much for bringing up El Salvador example. It's very interesting. And in terms of power relationship, you know why today El Salvador, and particularly San Salvador, is one of the most dangerous cities with the highest rate of homicide? Because after the war, there was an opportunity of banning small arms and light weapons. But the gun lobby in El Salvador, connected with the US, prevented the law to be passed in the parliament. They did everything possible. So post-conflict environment, all these ex-combatants without jobs, and availability of small arms, and on top of that, as this is not enough, the US decided to send MANAS members back to El Salvador, right? It's a powder keg, ready for explosion. So now, we say, oh my God, San Salvador is a dangerous city. Yes, of course, we created that. We transformed the violence from political to criminality. And it's the result of peace agreement we put together. And what happened afterwards. None of this is accidental, right? So branding of San Salvador as a dangerous city is a shame for everybody who took part in that process.
A gente tem um tempinho para mais uma pergunta, então.
No. Can we get two questions? Can we get two questions?
Yeah.
For
Absolutely. I'll keep it short.
Thank you. So I just would like to share some experience considering, first of all, just because you've mentioned El Salvador, and of course, conducting research in 2012 and 13. I could interview some of the actors and to identify some of them in Washington, D.C. in one moment that the party FLMN or FMLN, they were the government. So the members of the guerrilla, specifically those related to some military actions from the guerrilla, they were ambassadors or they were occupying some political activities regarding the government. And also making just one connection of who the people were before the war and after the peace agreements. I do remember to do an interview with the head of the police academy, and of course he was again in Washington D.C. because I just was there to conduct research. And I asked him before becoming a member and the chief of this department dealing with peacekeeping operations in the role of Salvador government. What was your job? And he referred to me, well, I was a professor in university, and I asked him, what changed your mind to become a police officer in the academy? He said, well, a better career. So he was just referring to money and better career. So he was a professor, then became a police officer. So that was the effect, direct effect of peace accords towards his life, right? But I remember also that you asked about what would be the role of Brazil as a rising power, considering some of the international conflicts, and just came to my mind. There is a Brazilian Agency for Cooperation, and in the time of the second mandate of President Lula, they had sort of 2 million reais, and of course, if we convert to dollars, it's not that much. But I do remember that time that Brazil was involved in the UN mission in Haiti, but also there was a moment of the Brazilian foreign policy towards Africa, specifically because the government in that moment knew that the private sector in Brazil had interests, and it was noticed in the 1990s because of Mozambique experience and even Angola, right? And in that second mandate, if I'm not mistaken, they were investing $1 million of this reais, of those 2 millions, in order to encourage to overcome local infrastructure of some countries. And I do remember that they helped bringing Senai, which is actually Senai. I'm sorry. They were training the local hotels and the employees in order to overcome their reality and to bring money toward through tourists, and some companies such as Camargo Correa, Odebrecht, they were building roads. Because it's their role, a specific role of expertise, and of course they wanted to make money with that. So that was the amount of budget, and also what the Brazilian private companies could bring as good results to the local community. And they were working, if I'm not mistaken, also with the local governments. Considering Haiti, maybe what I can stress is that there are different agendas if we refer to the Brazilian, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So they were thinking about, since the mid of the 90s, of pursue the goal of, if there was a sort of a reform on the Security Council, maybe Brazil could be a good candidate to become a permanent member. So that was a kind of bet of the first and the second mandate of Lula mandate. And of course they were thinking of the 2005 summit, and no reform was the result at all. But considering the goals of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, maybe they wanted to pursue peacekeeping operations as a good experience for Brazil to become noticed, considering the other actors and the rising powers in that moment. If we refer to military institution, and specifically the army, of course, they are probably they are informal, because I cannot speak on their behalf. There would be a mistake from my part. But maybe they wanted to engage in the demobilization of gangs, specifically in Porto Príncipe and specific neighborhoods, because in 2010 we had a huge coordination between Army, Navy, and some officers that were that they served in Haiti, but even federal policy and the military police in Rio de Janeiro, in some interventions considering local community like Morro do Alemão and other places. And in that specific moment, they were trying to recover or to manage the problems of public security considering those communities in order to make up the situation in Rio for Olympic Games and World Cup, right? And this is another specific topic of the agenda, considering the military institutions, and of course they want to share their experience and learn from other troops. And the civil society in Brazil, maybe I could highlight some NGOs that were working there, and specifically trying to build the connection with civil society. And their goal was related to humanitarian assistance, right? And considering scholars and researchers, some of them, they could reach the country in order to do field research, but considering that we do not have budget enough or enough amount to do that, so for a week or maybe 2 or 3 days or 15 days, or those that prepare their own budget in Brazil in order to go there and to interact and learn more about the country, then books and practitioners can talk or can teach to those people. So thinking about the Brazil of a rising power, I see Brazil as a facilitator of those different sectors of our society. And it's always, I see as an objective of bring the opportunity of those different actors to learn from the local community, and also to make other countries around the world, or maybe in the UN, to see Brazil as a different way, as I could learn from the Turkish experience in Somalia, in order to show to other countries, specifically to the north, and well, I would say to the traditional powers, that something different can be done, right? I don't know how different from the superpowers, but maybe Brazil has this kind of concern. So just some ideas I would like to share, considering the question that you made, and also because I had in one moment worked with not the UN mission in Haiti, the last one, but the first one, and Brazil was not involved. And just because I also would like to share that quick comment considering El Salvador, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rodrigo?
Okay, thank you for your lecture. It was very enlightening. So I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is about soft power. So I wonder if the Turkish government is applying any soft power strategy in Somalia. By the way, the Turkish soap operas are becoming very popular in Brazil, so that's why I'm asking that. The second question is, you said that the international community is highly selective regarding interventional and humanitarian missions, and I completely agree. But I also understand that governments and states are also selective in choosing the countries that the aid are going. And so my question is, why Somalia? And what could be the foreign policy goals at stake by boosting cooperation in Somalia? Thank you.
For Turkey. Yeah. Really 2 good questions. Thank you. The whole soft power, I mean, what I was describing earlier in terms of linking aid with trade, with education, with global transportation links and everything. Turkey was using other tools as part of aid. And I think that was different in the sense that it kind of sends a different message. But soft power around, in Somalia, a kind of interesting case, the religious affinity worked really in the advantage of Turkey. Muslim country helping another Muslim country, right? That's all I think is important. And they use that to a large extent. So the religious directorate of Turkey had its own programs in Somalia. And there were so many imams from Somalia were taken to Turkey for training, right? And why Turkey is doing that? Because Turkey wants to have a stronger presence in Africa. And rising powers really see Africa as a kind of a place of contestation with traditional actors. Because African countries are really sick and tired of Western interventionism and neocolonialism. They are looking for new partners, right? This is why China is so popular. This is why even India is popular, right? You know, China goes there and provides credits, not for the, you know, interests of those countries, but those countries need heavy infrastructure, like roads and railways, etc., right? And Chinese government says, well, okay, I'll give you that money, right? Indebtedness, and then China exploit minerals and all the things that they need. So nothing is for free. Turkey is not doing this for the sake of Africa. But I think differently from, I think, many former colonial powers, one, they don't have the same baggage, so they don't really need to justify. But also, really cleverly at least, this may be just a lip service, but cleverly, they are sending a different message. So when you do the content analysis of like the presidents of these different countries, the way they talk about Africa, right? I mean, France is just terrible. You know, France still refers to Africa as a kind of still a colonial place. I mean, you know, come on, we moved on. And so much so that their president says that, you know, colonialism was good for Africa. Hello, right? I mean, you know, it wasn't. But, you know, this is one hand, and on the other hand, leaders like you know, Erdogan and others saying that, well, okay, you know, we are here to work with you as partners. I mean, that's really important. And because dignity of Africa has been taken away from them for so long because of colonialism and post-colonial kind of experiences they had. So soft power is a big thing. What Turkey does, you know, under humanitarian diplomacy, that is the package they provide. You know, it's almost like step by step. You know, if Turkey has an interest in an African country, they open the embassy first. Turkish Airlines provide the connection, and then you have the business people going there providing the trade links, and then the, you know, the education links, always scholarships for those students. They open schools in those countries. So probably they behave like a colonial power of the past, but, you know, like a partner, right? So, you know, they are providing services to these countries, right? And it really kind of like is impactful because Turkey has more embassies today in Africa than France and United Kingdom. You know, these kind of, those countries where the colonial powers had the most embassies in Africa. Now, Turkey has more embassies. That shows that those whole links are really significant. But similarly, why they do that when it comes to any UN vote on like the UN security kind of membership, or this may be for Olympics, you know, you want to get the votes of African countries, right? There's soft power, you use that. Well, and also there are Turkish soap operas, right? You know, on top of that. But I mean, I think it's really kind of the whole entire package. And I think that this is why it's different, and it's worth investigating.
Thank you very much, Alp. So we can conclude our session today. Janina, do you want to say some words?
Just to thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting and to answer all questions. Thank you very much. Before closing, I would like to thank Vinicius. Obrigada, Vinicius, for record this session. Thank you very much. Obrigada. Thank you, Audio, for coming. Hope
Thanks,
you can
much appreciated.
back
And thank you, everybody.
again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank again the Department of Political Science, Professor Rafael Villa, Professor Rogério Arantes, and mainly to Professor Janina. Thank you.
Thank you.